3 years ago, my brother told me I should not miss attending our speaker's boot camp talks on investing at FreedomFest. And I was going to FreedomFest, I was there. But since they were at 7 a.m. in the morning in Las Vegas, and these FreedomFest talks go from 7 a.m. until about 10 o'clock at night. And I go to almost every one I can possibly go to. I was exhausted. So I only made one on the last day. It was possible, but it hooked me. Last year, my wife and I caught most of his 7 a.m. talks at FreedomFest. This year, we became investors finally. You know, it's kind of thick up there in his company, and I caught all his talks at FreedomFest. And I was able to meet him to confirm that he would be willing to speak here tonight. The bio on the invitation, which most of you have seen, gives you some further background on our speaker. But I'm sure you're as interested in hearing him tell you himself about his career and how Mises influenced him. This will be a very different talk than Anthony Gregory. It'll be very interesting too. So without further ado, please welcome Rick Rude.
Some of the things that I have to say that normally rub crowds the wrong way won't cause me problems here. It's a different way of saying it. It's nice to be among friends. I'd like to begin by thanking Peterson's. Doing a thing like this, convening a libertarian gathering, has often been described accurately, I think, as herding cats. The fact that they caused this to occur, I think, is a wonderful thing. By the way, it's always amused me that a group of people who don't believe in coercion and don't believe in governments, us, have a party. I'll just throw that out. I'm delighted that we do, but it has always amused me that we do that. So I was asked to speak on some of the practical aspects of Mises, how Mises has changed my life, how Mises has shaped my life, which I'm going to do because I find it interesting. But then I'm going to digress pretty hard and talk about how I think that Mises can help your life, which I think is probably going to be more interest to everybody else. We're going to talk about it in a couple of different aspects, but rather than threaten you with it, let's get started. First of all, there's a lot of people here who are students of von Mises. I'm not. I'm a beneficiary. I'm a capitalist. That's what I do. I'm not an economist. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a credit analyst. I'm one of those Shylocks, the green eye-shaped guys. And in fact, what I really truly am is a capitalist. When the discussion earlier in the evening was how did you get through, or how do you get through human action, I'm one of those freaks that could not put it down. The description about how it pulled you sentence by sentence by sentence is precisely what happened to me. I'm not only not an economist, I'm almost an anti-economist. I took a little bit of economics in my first year at university, and it seemed preposterous. I suffered through whatever that first year text is, Samuelson, I think it is.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, as an 18-year-old, it was pretty clear to me this isn't as good as a comic book. I mean, there was no benefit to me. I was interested in the topic of markets. And it wasn't until I read Human Action that there was a book that made some sense in terms of economics. So, as I say, in terms of changing my life, I guess one thing that book did was codify or explain my life, why things worked, how human action works, how society is in fact a market. And that was very, very, very useful. By the way, von Mises is described, of course, as an economist and a philosopher. I'm going to talk in a couple of minutes about why I think von Mises was a spectacular investment advisor. And we'll talk more about that in the second part of the talk, about how von Mises can shape the rest of your life. But I think he was a wonderful, wonderful investment advisor, although that was certainly not his intention. I think in particular, we'll talk later about the nature of human action and why understanding human action is important in understanding two very important facets of your life. One, the way that the political society is going to involve you, whether you want it to or not. And the way that human action, human nature, in fact, shapes markets and the behavior of markets, and further, why the attempt by the collective to alter a market is futile. I think that was his real contribution, if you will, to investment analysis. Where do I go with this? Let's start with human action. Economic cycles are part of normal human activity. Von Mises really makes it clear. How many people in the room have read Human Action? Okay, so this is worth going through because more than half of you haven't suffered through it. What von Mises teaches that's of critical importance is that your expectation of the future is shaped by your experience in the immediate past. And this is a very important revelation. If you're going to understand a market and a market cycle, this is critical. You hear the press people talk about animal spirits and bull markets and bubbles. What is that? It's because your experience in the past is shaped by your experience in the future. Your expectation in the future is shaped by your experience in the immediate past. Let me describe this in stock market terms. A bull market, you buy some stocks, the stocks go up. Sometimes they go up so fast that you even make money in your mistakes. It's a wonderful sort of thing. We talked at lunch today about my early experience, confusing a bull market with brains. It's an absolutely wonderful experience when it takes place, but it makes you quite aggressive. And so you have a situation, as an example, where you bought a stock, the stock goes up, you sell it. You are eager to redeploy the proceeds because you have enjoyed success and you feel good about yourself. And it's nice to feel good. And if you feel good about yourself a second time, this sort of action becomes addictive. And this sort of chain in motion goes on until, unfortunately, it ends. That's the nature of cycles, right? That's the nature of cycles. In truth, what you learn if you spend any time in markets is that markets actually work. We don't like the way they work because they're awfully bloody messy, especially when they work on us. But the truth is, and I wish Congress would understand this, the cure for high prices, Mises taught us, it's high prices. The cure for low prices are low prices. An example, 7 or 8 years ago, how many people remember, there was an enormous political issue with affordable housing. Well, we have the ability to have affordable housing now. It's just that we want the other person's house to be affordable. We don't want our house to be affordable. We had a period 5 or 6 years ago when natural gas prices were really high. And this sort of Malthusian club of our own thing that the natural gas price was going to go to wherever. Well, what happened? 2 things happened with high natural gas prices. People began to conserve, and other people found ways to make more gas. What happens when supply and demand lines cross? This is really simple stuff. But Mises, better than anybody else, explained that your expectation of the future is set by your experience in the immediate past. So in a bull phase, when the animal spirits are running rampant, I mean, a lot of people knew that real estate prices in Silicon Valley were unsustainable. A lot of people knew that single-family home prices weren't sustained by rents. A lot of people knew that the utility of real estate didn't explain the prices, but real estate went up, so real estate was going to go up. That's a bull market. When things come apart, when the markets work and things go the other way, your expectation of the future is also set by your experience in the immediate past. And if you, pardon my off-color remark, get your ass kicked a couple of times, you get a bit more cautious. The experience you had was not so pleasant, right? You bought a stock, it went down. You sold it for a 20% loss or 25% loss. You're a little less aggressive with regards to your reinvestment. And that's the nature of these cycles. The thing that's interesting about these cycles, and the thing we're going to talk about in about 10 minutes, is the fact that, in my experience, any attempt to alter this in some fashion, particularly collectively, is absolutely doomed to failure because it simply has to play out. It simply has to play out. What would have happened, as an example, mercifully it couldn't happen, if Congress had attempted once again to put price controls on natural gas? Think about what would have happened. there would have been no incentive to conserve, and there would have been no advances in technology that left us with the very, very, very low natural gas prices that we have now. How many people should be, would be, could be happy if the market were allowed to take its course with regards to housing prices? We certainly have within our hands in certain markets the ability to have affordable housing. Somehow that isn't an issue anymore. We're interfering with a market that's way overbuilt, a market that's way overserved. Do you understand where I'm going with this? And von Mises talked about this perfectly. Economic cycles are human action. So I want to talk about my own experience with cycles a little bit, and I want to talk about what Mises explained to me after I was a victim of it. Natural resource businesses, which is where I live, are extremely capital intensive and extremely cyclical. If you really, really, really want to see cycles, look in the natural resources business. So I'm going to take you through a cycle. And it's very interesting. I'm going to take you through a cycle, and I'm going to talk to you about the fact that investors have impeccable timing. They absolutely call bottoms and they absolutely call tops, but they do it back-asswards. So I'm going to pick on copper. They say, since there's some economists here, they allege that copper is the metal with the PhD in economics because it anticipates cycles. Many of you in the room are old enough to remember the cycle of the 60s, the sort of boom in the 60s. And copper came into the decade of the 60s very, very, very cheap. Very, very cheap. But the stage was set for an advance in copper because there had been no substantial investment in resource-based businesses for 2 decades before that. During the Depression, of course, there was no money to invest in the copper business, and during World War II, we had other things on our minds. Right? So there was a very long period, and really even coming into the 50s and 60s, because there was such enormous opportunities in other sectors of the economy, we had 20 or 25 years where, as a society, we were underinvested in natural resources in general, but copper in particular. And that set the stage for a spectacular bull market in the 70s. I can tell by the gray hair, or in some cases the lack of hair here, that some of you went through that market in the 70s. You will remember the greatest of all natural resources bull markets. And that was my sort of coming up years in resources business. Now, the copper business entered that decade at 25 or 30 cents a pound. It exited the decade at about $1.70 a pound. A pretty good move by any stretch of the imagination. And it makes perfect sense. We had underinvested in copper for 30 years, and the economy in the 50s and 60s and early 70s boomed, even as we had used up a bunch of copper supplies in World War II. So the stage was set for a pretty nice move. And you remember the 70s. You remember that there was a boom in all commodities. How many people here remember Jeremy Rifkin and the Club of Rome and all those morons? I mean, these were really, really, really special people. They took trends in motion. They extrapolated them to, never mind ad infinitum, ad nauseum. And you may remember that this group of geniuses decided that, as an example, by the year 2000, that 100 million people a year would be starving, and that the price of oil in nominal terms would be $500 a barrel. And it was really special stuff. But at any rate, it was a very heady time to be in the copper business. From the beginning of the decade of the 70s to the end of the decade of the 70s, the price of copper was up 5-fold. If you could make a little bit of money producing copper for 30 cents a pound, you made a lot of money producing copper for $1.50 a pound. And like all people do in the copper business, the management's confused a bull market with brains. They thought they were smart. And none of us, and I say us because I was certainly a culprit, as I'll explain to you in a moment, understood that there was a lot more utility to users with copper priced at 30 cents a pound than there was at $1.50 a pound. At 30 cents a pound, there was no sense to conserve because the stuff was cheap. At $1.50 a pound, if you didn't conserve, you went broke. Now, what's interesting... What's interesting to remember through this whole talk is that markets work. That'll be the ongoing theme. By sort of, I guess, 1980, when copper had already run 500%, the thesis associated with copper had been proven and was familiar to everybody. The point of this is when the cycle is almost over, is the point in time where it has its most adherence. They say on Wall Street that they don't ring bells at tops and bottoms. They do. They just disguise the message very, very, very carefully. And so, of course, markets did work. And from the peak of $1.50, $1.60 a pound in 1980, by 1986, the price of copper had fallen all the way down to 62 cents a pound. I told you, when we have cycles in the resource business, we have real cycles. So the price goes from $1.50 a pound to 62 cents a pound. That's a perfectly normal action because people were using less copper because it was too expensive. People were making more copper. And by the way, when you spend all the money to build a copper mine, you produce copper at almost any price you can get out of the ground. You sunk $1 billion into the mine, so you don't worry about losing a nickel a pound for a while. So, in 1986, scant 6 years later, the industry, the mining industry, is making copper. They're selling it for 62 cents a pound. They're making it for 80 cents a pound. Losing 18 cents a pound and being miners trying to make it up on volume. Problematic set of circumstances. At that point in time, Business Week magazine, my favorite whipping boy, Business Week magazine has a cover called The End of Mining. I don't know where they thought cars and refrigerators were going to come from, but they sort of prophesied the end of mining, which is also a very, very, very typical bear market reaction. People extrapolate trends in motion. But of course, in 1986, markets work. What happens at 62 cents a pound? Even guys as dumb as us in the resource business are not going to spend a couple $1 billion building a new copper mine when we're losing 18 cents a pound on our existing mine. And the people who are looking at conserving copper are finding ways to substitute copper for other stuff. Great utility for users. The market had to correct. If it hadn't have corrected, we wouldn't have had any copper. Which is like saying when we came into this room and we flipped the switch, the lights wouldn't go on. The price had to go up. It simply had to go up. And of course, because it had to go up, it did. Markets work. Here's the tragedy. And I think this is one of the reasons why we have such strange political problems in the country. Clients would call me twice during that cycle with impeccable timing, in an absolute panic to buy after the thesis had been proved and when it was no longer valid, and in absolute and utter disgust wanting to sell at the bottom. When people tell you in cycles, and von Mises knew this intuitively, when people tell you that something can't possibly get any worse, that's not a bad thing. What happens if it can't get worse? It gets better. And what happens when things can't possibly get any better? They don't. The essential thing that Mises taught me, well, he didn't teach me, the market taught me, was markets work. My own experience was in the 1970s. I was a young guy, an entrepreneur, and I went from success to success. I went from success to success for a couple of reasons. One, I worked hard, but much more importantly, much more importantly, I had the extraordinary good fortune to stumble into some businesses, natural resource-based businesses, that went very well. And I myself mightily confused a bull market with brains. I thought the rise in the price of copper, the rise in the price of oil and gas, rise in the price of gold, I think that was my fault. And one of the other things that happened to me, and we'll talk about this later on too, is I began to think, because I was so smart, that it would make sense for me to leverage my exposure to use other people's money. And I had a couple of banks, a Canadian bank in particular, that was sort of telling me that I was a blue-eyed sheep and a genius, and that my last name, although it began with R, really should be Rockefeller. And I wanted to believe that, and so I borrowed some money. And I learned firsthand the experience of a cycle. If you have borrowed too much money, and you take a $30 a barrel pro forma into a $12 a barrel world, remember that the assets on your personal balance sheet may be ephemeral, but the liabilities are always money good. Always money good. So my early experience gave me a slogan which I've used ever since, that von Mises didn't use, but he should have. In markets, and I would suspect in most human activities, you are either a contrarian or you're a victim. Those are your two choices. If you ignore human action, if you ignore the fact that people at their best are self-serving, are most honest when they're looking after themselves, then you will understand what a down cycle, either in a market or in some other endeavor, is for. It's for becoming aggressive. And you will understand that an upcycle, a bull market, is for being cautious. That's the nature, that's the essence of the impact of von Mises' lessons on human action in your markets, in financials. One of the other interesting things to me about von Mises has been, and I think this is also true about life, how learning compounds. And I want to share another story with you before I start talking about you instead of talking about me. I didn't know what a libertarian was for a long time, although I was one. It never occurred to me. It was a big word, and I was interested in making money as opposed to studying about money. I guess that's what I should say about myself. And I had read von Mises in university, but he didn't describe himself as a libertarian. He was an economist. I didn't know what a libertarian was. I had the real good fortune in the mid-'80s of meeting and becoming close friends with a guy named Doug Casey. And Doug Casey, I picked him up at the airport, and I was driving him down to my house in San Diego, and we stopped off at the house of somebody some of you may have heard of, John Pugsley, who's a great newsletter writer, great anarcho-capitalist, and having coffee with these guys, and they were talking a bunch of politics. So Pugsley says to me, he says, "Rick, what are your politics?" And I said, I don't have any. I want to be left alone, in return for which I'll leave other people alone. And he started laughing. He says, "Well, you're a libertarian." I said, "No, I'm not. That's Lyndon LaRouche. That's that guy in the airport. He wants to kill Jane Fonda and blow up whales, and I like whales, and I think Jane Fonda's a lot better looking than Lyndon LaRouche." And
Can't argue that.
John, yeah, it still works for me. John gave me a copy of Hazlitt's little book, Economics in One Lesson. He said, "Do me a favor, read this, call me Tuesday, we'll talk through it." Sure enough. And what was interesting to me as I began to get more involved in reading von Mises and reading the other people, von Mises was a very, very, very important part of Murray Rothbard's life. Murray became an important part of my life. And certainly Bob Kephart, who was maybe many of you know, was very important in that sort of the same intellectual chain. Then there was a guy named David Galambos, who I don't know if any of you know V50 or the volitional studies. They're really, really, really fantastic stuff. Then Pugsley, then Casey. And the point of all this is what has been wonderful for me about von Mises is seeing other people build on von Mises' lesson. Hearing the speaker before me tells me that the chain is very much alive. And a little bit later in this talk, I'm going to talk about where the chain goes from here. But I think it's very important that we all know that this learning compounds. It's very, very, very important. And he also talks about that in Human Action quite a bit. He talks about the benefits of this virtuous feedback circle that is a market. How participants learn from their actions and learn from the actions of others, and how over time the participants, if they pay attention, get more and more and more efficient at what they do. This is an important lesson that von Mises has to teach all of you. So, now, I'm going to stop talking about what von Mises has done for me, and I'm going to talk to you something about what I think von Mises can do for you. Because I think this is important. As I say, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to describe what I see going forward in economics terms. I am a credit analyst. And we are existing in a world, in a series of markets today, where the people, if you will, who run the place, the big thinkers, are making what I think is a really, really, really severe problem. My suspicion is that our current economic difficulty has to do with the fact that for 2 decades or 3 decades, a group of us, collectively, have lived beyond our means. We have financed our future, and we're running out of mooches to sell the paper to. I mean, there just aren't that many dupes left. Okay? This is a problem. Now, nobody wants to give up their standard of living. And we have this sort of political mechanism. By the way, anybody here read Ambrose Bierce? oh, you guys need to do this, the Devil's Dictionary. I'm going to give you a couple quotes because we're going to talk about politics. Two to begin with and one later. Ambrose Bierce describes politics. He says, to understand politics, one must look at the root words. Poly, from the Latin for many, and tick, from the English colloquial for small blood-sucking insect. And if you think about the response of the political process to a situation where for 2 decades people have lived beyond their means, and somebody has to pick up the tab, that describes politics, the nature of politics. And he describes, by the way, this comes next, Ambrose Bierce describes elections as, quote, advanced auctions of stolen property. The political process is very much a process by which you hire people. That's what we do. We hire people to steal from our neighbors and protect ourselves from their theft. Unfortunately, you can't redistribute insolvency very well. We have a set of situations here, and I don't know the numbers. I can't give you the numbers. I went to a dinner not too long ago where David Stockman was speaking, and I had expected this old beat-up Republican warhorse. I, in fact, found a guy who by now, having been through politics, would be very, very, very comfortable in this room. And he told us, and I don't know if these numbers are true, that the on-balance sheet liabilities of the U.S. federal government are somewhere between 16 and 17 trillion dollars. Now, these days, people throw around trillion like this. Anybody who has a pen and pencil, do me a favor. Write down 17 trillion. That's 17 with 12 zeros. It takes a long time to write it. Never mind to earn it, okay? So the top number we have is 17 trillion, a problem. The Congressional Budget Office, not people I would suspect who are good friends of liberty or people who are prepared to support the statement I'm about to give, suggests that the unfunded liabilities, the off-balance sheet liabilities of the federal government are $80 trillion. So add those two numbers, you got $97 trillion. There's some other people on our side which have higher numbers for unfunded liabilities. I don't know, but let's use their numbers, okay? I mean, we pay taxes, what the hell, let's use their numbers. They give us something. $97 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office also said that last year, for the first time in 20 years, American public generated surplus savings, $500 billion, like this is a good thing. So you write $500 billion, and this is where the credit analyst comes in. I don't understand trillions. I don't even understand billions. But I understand that if you take 97 trillion and 500 billion, and you scratch 9 zeros off both numbers, the collective balance sheet that we have at the federal level is pretty ugly. It's pretty ugly. We have a $97,000 debt, call it a credit card bill, that we're trying to service on $500 a year income. This I understand. Don't try this at home, folks. But that's what we're doing federally. It gets worse, by the way. I'm not going to bore you with the state of California's. But I live in a little community called Encinitas, California. Just moved there, pardon me. And our mayor proudly proclaimed 3 weeks ago that we had a balanced budget. He didn't count on a lot of things, but one of the things he didn't count on was me reading the budget. And one of the things I found out, and I didn't have to read too deeply, it's not like human action. It actually is boring. But one of the things I found is that we have a $80-something million unfunded pension liability. That's the net present value of the unfunded liabilities. And that assumes that the corpus of the money set aside to service the pension liability earns 8% per year. Okay, I don't want to get fancy with these guys. But let's assume that they're upside down 9.3% a year on an $80 million net present value, and they haven't made any pension contributions. Well, of course they have a balanced budget. If all I got to do was count my income and I didn't have to count my outgo, I could balance any budget you guys want to. I mean, this is truly insane. Truly, truly, truly insane. Von Mises, there was a little ditty that I used to hear a lot in the South when I worked down there, and it was really good. And we should teach the political class this. It goes like this. When your outgo exceeds your income, your upkeep becomes your downfall. It's really, really, really simple. When your outgo exceeds your income, your upkeep becomes your downfall. And these people have missed that. Von Mises got it. What you need to understand, and I'm sure most of the people in this room do understand, is that this is not going to have a happy ending. This is not going to have a happy ending. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not an economist. I'm not an apologist for libertarians. I'm certainly not a Democrat or a Republican. What I am is a credit analyst, and I know this for sure. I don't like simple declarative statements, but nobody in this room is good enough at math that you can add a whole column of negative numbers and come up with a positive. It just does not work. And this is not going to have a happy ending. And the fact that we have been trained as a society to react to these problems politically makes it much more serious from my point of view. My generation, the baby boomers, were sort of taught, first of all, the benefits of collective action, but we were also taught to believe that we were owed a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff. And I know personally, I can't say it statistically, but I can tell you anecdotally, I have a lot of friends who've made reasonable sums of money in their life, and they don't have any left. They forgot to save. They forgot to save. And this self-righteous crew, if they don't get their Medicare, and if they don't get their Social Security, they're going to be angry. I mean, they are not going to be happy campers. I have no idea how this plays out. Like Doug Casey says, I sort of hope that I have this lurid fascination with how it plays out. I sort of hope I see it from somewhere else on a widescreen TV. I mean, all the Western governments. What they're attempting to do is prevent a repeat of the 2008 crash. That seems pretty clear to me. They're trying to repeat a psychotic break that's liquidity driven. And I guess that's a laudable goal from their point of view. I think it's futile. I certainly believe this, and I hope the people in this room agree with me. The set of circumstances that were the conditions precedent to the 2008 collapse have not, in my opinion, been addressed. The over-leverage in the banking system, anybody think that's better? You know, when people talk about black swans on the horizon, by the way, after I get done making you sick, I'm going to try and make you well later. The cloud of potential black swans on the horizon makes picking out any individual black swan, from my point of view, sort of problematic. The key problem, as far as I'm concerned with regards to this, is that we are trying to solve a solvency issue with liquidity. Everybody understand what I'm saying? Yeah. We owe more than we can pay. And we're trying to deal with that by borrowing more. At some point in time, when you've dug yourself a hole this deep, you've got to understand they owe more than they have. Somebody is going to have to pay. Will it be the savers? Will it be the taxpayers? Or will it be the entitlements beneficiary? Anybody here know the answer? Yes. Yes. It will. It will be all of them. And none of them are going to like it. That's what's happening. The situation, I'll keep picking on Europe for a little while. The situation on Europe that I think everybody in this room needs to understand is really, really, really critical. The situation that you have in Europe with the financial institutions, we talked about this at lunch today, has been that private savers in Europe are smart enough to understand that the banks are upside down. They're insolvent. They're taking their money out. So if you look at the liability side of the bank balance sheets in Europe, you'll see private savings disintermediated from southern cone banks. And these savings are being replaced by letters of credit from the European Central Bank. Right. These aren't cash deposits. These are basically entries. On the asset side of the ledger, something equally fascinating is taking place. I say fascinating in a horrible sense. The banks are investing in sovereign debt because when they buy sovereign debt with such sterling credits as, say, Portugal, Ireland, Iceland, Italy, the pigs, they get to carry this debt on their books at par. They don't have to mark it to market. So they can buy Portuguese debt, which is selling at 70 cents on the dollar, and they can carry it on their books at 100%. The interesting thing that's happening is that the non-bank, non-official sector purchases of peripheral debt in Europe hover around zero. Nobody in their right mind would buy this crap. But the banks get injections of capital, ultimately from the German taxpayer, perhaps the unborn German taxpayer, and that money goes into these banks as letters of credit, and they use that money to buy newly issued bonds that nobody in their right mind would ever buy. The reason that I think this is important for all of us to understand here is, first of all, what happens around the world could impact us. But secondly, in a place a little bit closer to home, the United States of America, we bought 50% of our own bonds last year. What we make so much fun of the Europeans for is what we're doing here. We are, in fact, issuing paper from the Fed to the Fed. Now, let's call this for what it is. It's counterfeiting.
Yes.
More and more and more credits, electronic credits, that aren't matched by increases of the value of goods and services. Now, if the government really thought that counterfeiting was a good idea about this, and now I'm going to revert back to Ambrose Bierce one more time. Ambrose Bierce teaches that the root word of confidence, because this is certainly a system built on confidence, the root word of confidence is con. And we have a situation right now, I think, unless people do the math in the United States differently than I do, where everybody wants to believe that Bernanke's doing the right thing. Everybody certainly believes, maybe not everybody, but most people certainly believe that government services that benefit them are essential services. And most people believe that government services that don't benefit them are fraud and waste and abuse. The point of this is, I think, that more than ever before, you're going to have to take care of you and yours. And you're going to have to be beginning to prepare to take care of you and yours right now. My friend Robert Friedland, whenever he hears me go through this sort of diatribe, he has this wonderful saying, and it's true. It goes like this: the situation is hopeless, but it need not be serious. In truth, if everyone was looking after themselves, we wouldn't have any social problems. Right? What social problem would there be if everybody was looking after themselves? What von Mises said about human action, what von Mises said about the futility, in fact, the dangerousness of a political solution, is in, I think, the end game. When I say the end game, I'm not talking about the fact that we're going to blow up and crash and burn or anything like that, but I think it's going to be very, very, very serious. I think it's going to be very, very, very unpleasant. And I don't think that there's going to be anybody that's going to help you and your family get through it, except for you and your family.
Right.
What can you do? In some senses, I don't know. And maybe I'm talking my book now, but in a situation where the society does begin to lose faith in the currency, that's going to be problematic. I mean, what is this thing? It's a promise to pay. And the difficulty with those promises to pay is that they're just that. This is a lead up to saying, and you don't have to buy it from us, buy yourself some gold. Buy yourself some gold. Gold is, through history, and it doesn't have to be gold. It can be silver, Barry. It can be platinum. Buy yourself some bullion. For, depending on the civilization, the ethnic group that we come from, somewhere between 2,000 years and 5,000 years, precious metals have been simultaneously a medium of exchange and a store of value. They aren't a promise to pay, they're payment. You don't have to trust somebody to give you the value for the certificate. You already have the value. I would ask people in this room to buy such bullion, how would you say, an amount that you think reasonably would assuage your fear. I'm in this odd position because of what I do for a living. The name Sprott, the place I work, is sort of synonymous with bullion. And a rational person would say, Rick, you don't have to buy any bullion at all, because if the price of gold or silver goes up, your business is going to do so well and be so valuable you don't need to. But I still own a lot of bullion, and I, honest to God, hope when I'm 90-year-old or 95 years old or however old I am, when I become reflective, I look back and say, that insurance policy that you bought, that gold, was a waste of money. Buy yourself some gold, buy yourself some silver, buy yourself some platinum, and pray that the smart people that I've taken through this sort of circumstance say, you know, Rick, you're right, but we went through World War II. We've been through worse than this. We can come out. And I believe that to be true. I have no idea how we can come out. I look to the prior speaker as providing some hope. I think we can get through this. And when every risk I talk to you about, the government, war, resource shortages, all those types of things, all those risks, the principal risk I think that we all face, certainly the risk that's been the greatest in my life, has been really, really, really easy to focus on. The greatest risk that we all face, in investing at least, is conveniently located to the right of our left ear and the left of our right ear. We can control the way we respond to a real descriptive tome about how life works, and that's a descriptive tome about the way that markets work. Not that this group would rely on political solutions to their problems, but don't rely on any solutions to your problems other than your own actions. And please begin to take action now. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time and attention.